In this video, I'm going to talk about my process for solving an issue that I feel it definitely hindered me in my career and that continues to hinder writers all over the world, and that is finding similar books and readers in your genre. So this is a common marketing problem. I have launched a new pen name in the urban fantasy genre, and I decided to see if I could do something about this and create some sort of a meaningful solution just for myself, but it also evolved into being able to help some other people with this. So as an FYI, I do follow the Lean Six Sigma methodology when I'm solving problems. Not 100%, but if you've never heard of that before, just know that some of the stuff you see here may look a little weird to you. I don't think anyone's ever done anything like this in the publishing industry, but Lean Six Sigma is a methodology in solving problems. And it's a framework in thinking to where you can take a pain point or a problem and figure out the best way to address it. And the process of this is called root cause problem solving. And I've actually, in my day job, I've led entire teams through this as a manager. And so it was kind of interesting to do it by myself. So just know that's the methodology I'm using here. I didn't follow it 100%, but followed it pretty closely. So first, let's talk about the problem. What is the problem here? Finding similar books and readers in your genre. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? Urban fantasy authors struggle to find similar books in their genre because there are few tools to assist them. This causes tactical errors in the production and the promotion of the book, so that leads to your cover, book description, marketing, etc., and resulting in missed sales opportunities and lost income. This issue affects authors of virtually every genre, but urban fantasy authors in particular because the genre is often confused with paranormal romance. The genre is large, growing, and still relatively unexplored. It also affects readers because they cannot always reliably find books in the genre that they will love. So this is the problem that we're dealing with here. The common advice that we're always given when it comes to marketing our book is know where your target readers are and where they hang out. And I don't know about you, but until now, every time I've heard that question or heard that advice, I've wanted to beat my head against the wall because it's really not that easy. Like, I know there's some people out there that maybe know how to do it, but I am certainly not in that minority. I think that this problem affects at least 90 to 95% of most authors, particularly those who are not selling, because yes, they know what genres they're writing in potentially, and yes, they know one or two or maybe three books that are similar to theirs, but it's not always easy to read 100 books in your genre, and there are books out there that could be similar to yours that maybe you can't discover them because they're not selling on Amazon. And so you can't get to those books through the bestseller lists. You can't get to those books through a recommendation if no one has read it. And so you have this weird issue where you understand the advice, but you just can't quite find those books and therefore just can't quite find those target readers. So that is the problem at hand here. Now, who's affected by it? Well, I believe that readers are primarily affected by it. They're the biggest stakeholder here because if they can't find books that they love, then they're not going to buy those books or they're going to do something else. And so therefore, everyone in the industry suffers. And so indie authors, I believe, are the second most affected because they are pretty close to the marketing of their book, and almost all of the marketing falls on them. And if they are successful, it's probably because of the marketing. If they are not successful, it's probably because of the marketing. But this also affects traditionally published authors as well because they're also responsible for the marketing of their book. And for fringe stakeholders here, I do think that traditional publishers would benefit from finding a solution to this problem, because if all of their authors had better tools to promote themselves and to promote their book, then that would help the publisher's bottom line as well. And same goes for book retailers, right? They're not really active stakeholders in this process, but if we were able to find a solution or something that helped, at least in the urban fantasy genre, then book retailers would see increased sales. And this is just scratching the surface. I do believe that this problem affects the entire industry. If authors knew how to solve this problem, or if this was not a problem, then I do think that everyone in the industry would be making more money. So what is the current process? When you think about a problem and you think about why it exists, you have to look at the current state. So what are authors doing today? What kind of things are they doing today to find readers in their genre. And so this is what I believe the process is. And this is not just my process, but this is having talked to some people. And this is that the author writes the book, they use existing tools out there to find similar books. And sometimes those tools are imperfect, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then they use those tools to compile a list of similar books. Every author works differently, and everyone may do these things in a different order, but the steps are the same. Write the book, use the tools out there to create a list of books that are similar to yours, and so when you're marketing your book, you can compare your book to those books. So let readers know that this is a book that they probably want to read if they like the books that are on your list. So I'm not going to go through everything on this list, but these are what I believe are the current tools that authors have to find similar books in their genre. And you're probably thinking, well, this is a lot of tools. What's the problem, right? But the problem is that each of these tools, in a way, has its own little poison pill that just makes it not effective. For example, one of the easiest ways to find similar books is to go on Amazon. And all you have to do is go to the Amazon product page, scroll down about a third of the way through the page, and you'll see a carousel of books. Those are called the also bots. And then you'll see another carousel, and those are the Amazon ads. Those are the authors that are paying to advertise on that book page. And you can scroll through those for 10, 15 minutes, find 60, 70 books that are related to this book. The problem with that, though, is that also bots are only going to work if those books are selling. So if book A is selling really, really well, it's probably going to show up in the also bots of other books in that genre. If book B is selling really poorly, then it's not going to show up at all because readers are buying book A, but they're not buying book B, and so therefore there's no association. The other thing is it's based on what readers buy. So if you have one reader that buys science fiction and then you have other readers that buy fantasy, well, it's just going to be based on what they bought. It's not necessarily based on books that are actually similar to the genre. And the same goes for bestseller lists. You know, there's all kinds of weird things with the Amazon and other book retailers' bestseller lists that, you know, there are hundreds of thousands of books that are not getting any exposure on those lists. And so what you see on a bestseller list does not necessarily reflect the reality of the genre. The point I'm trying to make here is that there are a lot of good books that are just simply buried and are not being discovered because of this problem. Now, you could also say this to Goodreads. Goodreads is a wonderful service. It has a number of tools that authors can use to find books in their genre, particularly urban fantasy. But the problem with Goodreads is that it has a recommendation engine, but it's not always accurate. If you've ever used it and got recommendations from it, sometimes you scratch your head, and I don't know that it's getting much better. And it doesn't allow you to go really deep into the genre. It only takes you surface level, and we'll talk more about that here. And then there are other things that you can do, such as going to physical libraries. There's social media interest groups that readers put together where you can find books, and there's librarian reference books, which is something I don't know that everybody knows about, but nobody knows books better than librarians. Use the tools that they use in order to find books. That's a wonderful way to find books, but it's still not 100% accurate. And we can't replicate word of mouth. We some people may not have readers that they can survey. So each one of these tools here, if you sat down and tried to use all of them, you probably could come up with a list, but it would take you a lot of time. And again, the tools are not perfect. So the question is, well, why is this important? Like, how are authors using these lists of similar books? Well, they use them in every step of the process. They use them to design their book covers, because the best cover designers will not design a cover without knowing at least 2 or 3 similar books in a genre. So that is an effective thing to send your book designer. And then in writing book descriptions. So how many times have we seen in a book description, if you liked X book, you'll love this book, right? That's a classic way that authors are using similar lists of books in their book descriptions. They use it to write ad copy. So you can advertise on Amazon and on Facebook, and in those ads, often you'll see things that compare a book to another book. Developing a marketing and promotion plan if you don't know what books are similar to yours, how are you going to target the people that that like those books? How are you going to come up with a plan on reaching them, right? And also selecting book promotions. So authors, independent authors in particular, have a unique ability to schedule their books in book promotion services where these services have developed large mailing lists of readers. And authors simply pay a fee to advertise their book to those readers, and they simply drop the price for a day or two, and then those readers go out and buy the book. And then if it's a series, then that promotes and improves the visibility of that author series. It's a mainstay of independent authors, but it's very hard to get into a book promo if you don't know what books are similar to yours, or you could be selecting the wrong promos. If you have a genre specific book promotion service, you could be promoting your book to the wrong readers. This list is invaluable for finding other authors to collaborate with, particularly if you are an independent author, because that is another mainstay of independent and self-published marketing, and that is finding other people to collaborate with so that you can cross-promote your book. Hard to do if you don't know what books are similar to yours. Also, authors are using this list to find interested reviewers. There was, up until recently, a fair amount of service providers who could take a list of books on Amazon and then go mine those books for all the reviews. And then they could produce a list of reviewers who reviewed those books so that authors could email them and ask if they would be interested in reviewing their book. Those services, to my knowledge, no longer exist, but if you are looking for book bloggers or you're looking for reviewers or people that would like to review your book, it's always a good idea in your review pitch when you're emailing them or you're talking to them to say, hey, I noticed that you read this book. I think you'll like my book because of X, X, and X, right? And then finally, authors can use this list to decide what to write next. If they're writing to market, or if they don't know what to write next, they can use this similar list of books to figure out, well, what are the gaps in the marketplace, or what are some of the things that my readers like, right? So here's the thing. If this list is inaccurate, then the author's time, effort, and money may be wasted. So they could do all those tools that I talked about on the prior slide, but if they develop an inaccurate list, then it's all for nothing. So moving on through current state and just analyzing the state of how things are. All right, so this is a representation of categories that the top 100 bestsellers use to categorize their urban fantasy books on Amazon. I did compile this data from my friend Alex Newton, who runs a service called K-Lytics. This is from the 2018 K-Lytics Urban Fantasy Report. So again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the categories that are available on Amazon for authors to select, so that when readers want to look up urban fantasy and they click urban fantasy on a book product page and it takes them to other books that are in that category on the bestseller list, so the popularity list, this is what authors have the ability to do. So you'll see here that there's only one category for science fiction and fantasy for urban fantasy. And if you look at it, it's the one in red. It's fantasy, paranormal, and urban. What this tells me, at least subliminally, is that this is for urban fantasy and paranormal romance. Now, you could use some of these other genres here, like mythology and literature and fiction and mystery, thriller, and suspense, because there is a time and a place for mystery, thriller, and suspense in urban fantasy. But that's not many categories, right? And the other genres here are often used, but more than not, they're not an accurate descriptor of most of the urban fantasy books that use them. Authors have no choice but to use these categories, though, because they're the only categories that are available. And to be honest with you, there are some people that abuse this system to the point that it frustrates and it further pollutes discoverability. I've seen authors promote urban fantasy in the children's book categories, which makes no sense. I've also seen traditional publishers abuse categories. And on one hand, you can't blame them because there's no other categories available, so you've got to use the tools you have. But on the other hand, this category system, it's just not good. It doesn't go deep enough. So even if you could develop a list of similar books, you would have a hard time classifying your book on a book retailer. All right, so as we think about this project, I thought about scope. So what can we control and what can we not control? So here's what we can't control. We can't control the BISAC categories. Like, I can't control this classification system. It's flawed, and it really doesn't suit the purposes of modern marketing. But you know what? That's not my problem. I can't solve that problem. I also can't change anything that online retailers are doing. I would hope that the good people at Amazon and Kobo and Barnes& and Noble are watching this video, but I don't expect them to take any action based on this problem statement. And I can't do anything about the bad actors in the industry. So I can't do anything about the category abuse, unfortunately. But here's what we can control. As a community, we can define the subgenres of urban fantasy in a logical way, and we can encourage other authors and readers to do the same. Again, as a community. And we can control access to readers. We can control access to other authors for the most part. And we can control the creation of new tools if we wanted to create those tools in order to do something about this problem. So if we focus on what we can control, suddenly you start to see that maybe there is something that we can do. Now, let's talk about the benefit of doing something. Imagine if writers could easily find a complete list of similar books in their genre with 100% accuracy. Imagine if they could position their books in the market accordingly. We're envisioning what the world would look like if this problem didn't exist, right? The future state. For me, this is what that would look like. Easier discoverability for readers. Readers buy more books they love. Writers can write more books they love because they're making more money, and then everyone wins. Okay, so don't let this slide scare you. This is what's called a fishbone diagram, and it's something that is commonly used in the Lean Six Sigma methodology to find the root causes to problems. So once you've identified your problem, and then once you have examined all of the current state and the data of the market as it is, or the problem as it is, then you can use this methodology to get to the root cause or causes of the problem. So all you need to know here is that I analyzed this problem in a number of ways, and I found what I believe were 5 root causes to the problem of authors not being able to find similar books in their genre. 3 of them I could do something about, and 2 of them I could not. So I tried to examine this problem from as many angles as I could, because I feel like that's always a good way to look at any problem. And I thought about the systems that authors use, right? And there really is no uniform system, but we talked about the tools that they use, and we talked about those tools not being accurate and complete. Well, why is that? What's the reason for that? Well, it's because most of those tools, if you think about it, are based on the BISAC system, or they're not based on any system at all, and that only goes skin deep. And I think the reason for that, and we're going to talk about this, and we're going to spend some time on this, is that there's no universal subgenre for urban fantasy. Like, there's no universal way to talk about an urban fantasy book other than saying that it's an urban fantasy book. I think that that's a root cause that I wanted to dig into. From a process perspective, I talked about the ways that authors worked, right? And how that those ways can be inefficient, you can waste time, money, and effort. And I also think that we're going to all these different places and all these different tools, but there's no real strategy. It's just, what can I find? I'll be lucky if I find anything. And I think that the root cause of that, if you really think about it, is that there's a lack of proper education available about this topic online. Like, there's everyone and their brother will say, well, you need to know how to find your target market. But no one can sit here and tell you how to actually do it. And if they do tell you how to actually do it, it's really not that accurate most of the time, right? Because it's involving the tools that I mentioned on the previous slide. So I do believe that there's a lack of proper education available on this online. Can I impact that? I don't know if I can change it, but maybe I can do something about that. There's forms, which really is just the result of the marketing. So, authors are doing improper marketing as a result of having these inaccurate lists. And so the root cause of that, I believe, is a lack of genre knowledge. And if you want to dig a little bit further into that, it ties into these other 2 root causes, which is there's no universal subgenre classification system. There's a lack of proper education online on how to actually find books in your genre, and then there's a lack of genre knowledge for a lot of writers. So there's 2 root causes that there's just nothing I can do about them, right? And one of those problems is, well, writers say that I just don't have time to sit down and read. I'm a writer, but I don't have time to read. That's a very common problem among writers. But you have to read in order to be successful. And I think that the root cause of that is that the root cause of not having time to read is a lack of time or passion. Sometimes you have authors that are writing in genres that they're not really passionate about, and so that's what happens. And so ultimately, I think the root cause of that is it's family, work, or other obligations if that author's not full-time, and you can't blame them for that, but that's not a problem that I can solve. And again, this is not meant to be a dig or an attack on anybody. I'm just calling it like I see it. Another problem that I can't solve is the category abuse, like I talked about. And I think that abuse exists because retailers use BISAC, and there's a good reason for them to do it, but there's just not as much flexibility with that. And so as a result, the industry as a whole hasn't adopted more granular discoverability. They could solve this problem if they really wanted to, but I have a feeling they're probably not going to solve the problem. So again, that's not something that I can do anything about. And by the way, I got this diagram template courtesy of GoLean6Sigma.com. They're not sponsoring this video. They have nothing to do with the publishing industry as far as I know, but they offer really great tools for the root cause problem solving process. And if you're interested in learning more about this methodology, you're more than welcome to check them out. They are a fantastic website. All right, so these are our root causes of the problem. So when you have a root cause, the best thing to do is, okay, how do we develop what we call not a solution, but a countermeasure, so that when you implement the countermeasure, the problem goes away. And then the best way to think about it is if you stop doing the countermeasure, then the problem comes back. It's like a light switch. You flip it on, the problem goes away. Flip it off, the problem comes back. So what does that look like? What are some of the things we can do? So these are the countermeasures that I came up with. So the first, to address the first root cause, was a universal classification system for urban fantasy, to come up with a better way to more logically define the genre so that readers can more easily find the books that they like. Second countermeasure I thought would be appropriate was a spreadsheet database of every urban fantasy series that has ever existed. That sounds ambitious, but I'll talk more about that later. And so the last countermeasure was just an education campaign. So that's videos on my YouTube channel, blog articles or guest blog articles, and then podcast interviews to help spread the word of the ideas that I'm talking about in this video to help get at that education problem. So countermeasure number one is a universal classification system. So I believe, this is Michael Laron's opinion only, that the existing definitions of urban fantasy don't go deep enough. We have to change that. So this is what it looks like. You have the fiction genre, and then you have the fantasy genre, and then you have the urban fantasy genre. You can kind of see the pedigree there, but it doesn't go deeper than that. There are plenty of books that could go deeper, but everything is just kind of lumped into one. It's called urban fantasy, but it's so much more than that, right? And so here's what I propose. I think that we need classifications that actually describe the books in the way that readers discover them. So using the diagram on the past slide, let's pretend we're going deeper. So the question that I like to ask is, how deep can I go without splitting the atom? How deep can you go in this genre to describe a book in the urban fantasy genre before urban fantasy is no longer urban fantasy? And so this is what I believe. I think that the gender of the hero is a major component of what readers are thinking about when they're selecting a book. I do believe that readers will read male and female urban fantasy, but I do think that they have a preference, and I think that's an important piece. It's why you almost always see the hero of an urban fantasy book on the cover, because it lets the readers know, is it a male or is it a female? I also believe that the setting is equally as important. There has to be a city, for the most part, in urban fantasy, but does it take place in the real world, like ours, or does it take place in a fictional world? I think that's an important distinction. And then also the type of protagonist, i.e. supernatural character. What are they? Are they a vampire? Are they a werewolf? Are they a witch? Are they a wizard? Are they a necromancer? That's incredibly important, and I believe it's one of the driving ways on how readers should be finding books in the genre, because right now there's no way for me to say, if I like books with witches in them, I'm going to go find every book in the urban fantasy genre with witches. Readers can't do that today. And then also the profession of the protagonist. It's not as important, but I think it intrigues people. Like Mercy Thompson is an auto mechanic by day. Harry Dresden is a private investigator. What are these characters doing on a day-to-day basis that complements their supernatural abilities, if they have any? And then there's the actual subgenre, and that whether it be detective, whether it be mystery, whether it be a traditional type urban fantasy story, I think that every book has a subgenre that you can easily slot it into. So let's put this classification system to work, and let's look at one of the most popular urban fantasy series in the world, and that is the Dresden Files. So the Dresden Files, if you look at it and break it down into this system, it's a story about a male hero who lives in Chicago, who is a wizard, who is a private investigator, and the book is in the detective/crime subgenre. That is the Dresden Files. So if I were to describe the Dresden Files to someone, instead of saying it's an urban fantasy with a wizard, that means nothing, right? It's about a male wizard who lives in Chicago, and he's a private investigator and uses magic to solve crimes. It's a far better way of describing the Dresden Files. Now let's look at another popular urban fantasy series, and that's the Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series. So, female protagonist, takes place in the real world in the city of St. Louis. Anita Blake is a necromancer. She is also a private investigator, and the story is a detective/crime story, right? At least the first book is. So if we were to describe Anita Blake to someone, we would say Anita Blake is a story about a female necromancer who lives in St. Louis and hunts vampires and uses necromancy to do it, and she also solves crimes. That is how you would describe Anita Blake. Now, here's where this classification system really helps you. You can use it to compare two books to each other. So, this is a visual representation of those same slides that came before, but just next to each other so you can see. Right, so we can look at these and we can compare them, and we can draw some conclusions based on what these classifications are. So how Harry Dresden and Anita Blake are different is that Harry is a male wizard who solves murders in Chicago, and Anita Blake is a female necromancer who works in St. Louis and who hunts vampires. Right, so you could say that the color of Anita Blake is certainly different than the color and tone of Dresden, but they do have some commonalities, and so you can use those commonalities to speak to readers. So why does this matter? Well, both the Dresden Files and the Anita Blake series take place in a real-world city, and they are detective crime stories at their heart. What makes them different is the hero and heroine. Therefore, both stories share the same subgenre and should enjoy reader crossover. But the question is, what if a urban fantasy writer writes a book about a necromancer and wants to find a list of similar books to Anita Blake with necromancers? Now, we know that the existing tools out there are not perfect. They're not going to give you probably what I would call a perfect list. So this is where countermeasure number 2 comes in. This is what I call a free urban fantasy database. So the goal here is to create a free web-based database using the new urban fantasy classification system. Invite authors and readers to submit as many urban fantasy series as possible to that database following the system, and then policing that database to maintain high accuracy. So that way we can weed out most paranormal romance, we can weed out erotica, we can weed out reverse harem titles, which is a common frustration, so that everything you see on that database is true urban fantasy. And so the result is an easy way for the entire urban fantasy community to get a list of similar books in just a few seconds. Now, the beauty of this is that this started off as a tool for writers. Like, that was my initial intent. But as I got deeper into this, and as I really started thinking about what I could do with this, this is a tool that actually has a bigger impact on readers. Like, it has a huge impact on readers. And so I decided, well, if it has a bigger impact on readers, it's probably a better idea to market it as a reader tool, and then market it on the back end to writers as a tool that they can use to find those lists of similar books. So this is what we ultimately came up with. So I originally conceived this idea as just a simple Google spreadsheet that anyone could view. And I ran that idea by a few author friends in the urban fantasy genre, and they all agreed. This problem is very real for them. And I talked to probably 15, 20 people, and they all expressed the same problem. And so I knew I had a pretty good idea at that point. And so John P. Logsdon and Ben Zackheim of the Author Helper, they're two urban fantasy writers as well. They reached out to me and they expressed some interest in working with me. And they're also urban fantasy authors, and they actually wanted to do something similar to this. Like there was a similar idea that they had marinating, but they hadn't done anything with it yet. And so I came along, and so I thought, oh, why don't we partner together to work on this, because this could actually be pretty cool and pretty helpful. So I conceived the idea, and I came up with it and drafted it. I mean, I had already done it at this point before I reached out to people, because I was going to build it myself. But I supplied that to John, and John is a programmer by trade, and so he built this database on the Author Helper website. So they host it because it's just easier for him to provide programming support and things like that to it. But we co-branded it. So I conceived it, but John built it, and the whole process took about 2 to 3 weeks from start to finish. And so once it's done, now I'm maintaining it. So any submissions that come through to it, I am maintaining it. So as you can see here, and I've done other videos on how to use this database, but basically you can search by author name and you can filter by virtually any parameter. So if you want to find all the books that have males in the database, all you have to do is click the filter. If you want to find all the books that have necromancers, then all you have to do is click that filter, and you can find all the books that have necromancers. If you want to find all the books that are cozy mystery urban fantasy, that have witches or werewolves as the detective, you can do that. You can find all those books, and then you can slice and dice this database any way you want. If you want to find books that have werewolves in them that are LGBTQ, then you can do that. So I was really happy with the way this turned out, and you can even add books to the database and make recommendations by entering a form, and then that form goes to me, and then I simply review it and approve it or alter it, or in some cases reject it. And so that way we can maintain the integrity of the database. And so the beauty of this tool, it's almost like a Swiss Army knife, because if every author shared it with their readers, and if we empowered readers to take this tool and put as many books as they've read into it, and we had 100 different readers that did that, oh man, I almost fall out of my chair every time I think about that. I mean, we could get a database of hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of urban fantasy series. Imagine how powerful that would be. Imagine if you're an urban fantasy reader and you are struggling with this same problem of figuring out what to read, because Amazon doesn't make it easy, right? Because it's hard to find books that you like that are in the urban fantasy genre, and it might be a paranormal romance, because they lump them all together. So readers have this problem. It's a very real problem. Imagine if you're a reader and you can just go to this database and you can figure out what you want to read in just a few seconds. And the database has pretty much 95 to 97% of all the urban fantasy that's on the market. Imagine how powerful that would be. Imagine if you were a writer, right? Because I didn't want to lose track of who my key people here are. As a writer, if you want to write an urban fantasy book and you know that it's going to be about a witch, but you're not quite sure how or what other authors in the genre are doing with their witch books, all you can do is go to this database, filter it, and you can get a list of all the urban fantasy books that have witches in like 10 seconds. That's the beauty of this tool. And so then I started thinking, well, authors and publishers can use this and take it further, right? Because anytime they have a new series launch, they can just simply come to this database and update it. So then that way it becomes a free marketing tool for them. It's in their best interest to update the database whenever they have a new book launch. And then if we're driving traffic to it, if we're getting authors to link to it from their website, from their social media, from their mailing lists and newsletters, and then we're getting readers to share it amongst themselves, this is just going to be a snowball effect, right? Now here's the thing. I recognize that this database has its flaws. Like, it has its weaknesses, right? So if no one uses it, it's not going to be that effective. But I do think that that's a minor flaw if you think about the actual benefit, right? So yes, I'm aware of the weaknesses and the flaws. That's something I definitely paid attention to, but I still believe that the risks of those flaws don't outweigh the benefits. So I'm really happy with what we came up with here. I think that this is a very practical tool and it's very simple. So who wins, right? Well, writers receive an easy way to find accurate targeted lists of similar books, and from a database of hundreds, maybe thousands of series. Readers receive the best discoverability engine for urban fantasy that currently exists, one that's built for the way that they read. And then publishers, traditional small press and indie, have a centralized location full of readers to submit new titles, and it's a centralized location that's updated regularly. And last but not least, book retailers reap the benefits of increased sales because readers can more easily find books that they love. Countermeasure 3 was a marketing campaign to try to boost education and awareness on thinking about urban fantasy in a different way. So for authors, the way that I would market this to them is to use the database for marketing and promotion, to link to the database from their websites, because I believe that a rising tide lifts all boats. So if we got a fair amount of authors to do this, then we would improve things substantially for all of us. I encourage them to submit their new series launches to the database. It's based on series, not by book, but to submit new series to the database and to share this with their author friends. And for readers, it's really simple. Just use the database to find your next read, make recommendations of any books that you love that aren't in the database, and share it with your friends. For publishers, they can do the same thing that authors can do. And then for influencers, the book bloggers of the world, the YouTubers of the world, the podcasts of the world that talk about urban fantasy, use this database and share it with your audiences. Influencers are going to be a very important part of this campaign just to spread awareness of the book and of this particular issue. So why do this, Michael? What are we going to learn? Well, I break this down into two areas. At the high level, from a big picture perspective, I think we're going to learn some things that we didn't necessarily know about urban fantasy. So the bigger the database gets, the better it's going to get. Like I said, imagine what this is going to look like if it's got several hundred titles in it. Imagine what it's going to look like if it's got 1,000 titles in it. And so then that got me thinking, how big is the urban fantasy genre, roughly? Is it 500 series? Is it 1,000 series? Is it 10,000 series? I have no idea, and I think we're going to find out. How many authors are writing in the genre? And how many of those are indie, and how many of those are traditionally published writers? Because there's this myth, I think, that traditional publishers have abandoned urban fantasy because they find it no longer profitable. I think this might help us determine whether that's true. And then how many readers are visiting this database each day, month, and year? It'll be very interesting if we can share this, and if it gets legs, how many people are actually coming to the site every day? That give us a pretty good snapshot of some of the volume. And then, can this countermeasure work? And can these countermeasures work in other genres? I believe they can. I believe that you can come up with a universal classification system for space opera. I think you can do it for romance. I think you could do it for epic fantasy. I mean, there's no shortage of genres where you could take this same methodology and apply it to. So if you're watching this and you don't write urban fantasy, by all means, try something like this in your genre, and I would be curious to see what happens. Now, low level, looking at the little picture, looking at the pixels in the picture, what are we going to learn? Well, which characters and subgenres in urban fantasy are the most concentrated and saturated, right? What characters and subgenres are the least saturated? What characters and subgenres are the least concentrated? Perhaps readers want more of those, so maybe readers want more dystopian urban fantasy. That's a thing, by the way. And then what unusual but intriguing groupings exist, i.e. post-apocalyptic urban fantasy? I came across one of those the other day, and my head almost exploded. I didn't know that existed. And so by using this database, you're going to be able to see some interesting combinations together, and that might generate some pretty cool ideas for new books for writers. And then lastly, it's just kind of a funny question, but do we truly have too many vampire books, or are we just getting started? Some other things we can learn if we wanted to, and I don't know that I'll do this, but a voluntary reader survey to learn more about their reading habits and how they find books. That might be helpful. I don't know how helpful it will be ultimately, though. But we can get additional feedback from readers in this database, and they can click a link, and that will generate an email to me where they can let us know what they think. And honestly, if they love it, we'll know, and if they hate it, we'll know too, because it'll start to gather dust, and there'll be crickets and it'll be a ghost town. But we think, John and Ben and I, that this is going to be a very helpful tool. So, and there's just so many other things that we can learn that we haven't even thought about yet. So if this process has intrigued you, the next steps are to check out the Urban Fantasy Book Database. Certainly check it out at the link there and at the link below this video, and just give it a go and see what you think. If there's an urban fantasy series that you don't see in this database and you're an avid reader, feel free to add it. I will be approving and reviewing every submission that comes through. And if you're an urban fantasy writer, by all means, please include your series. So share this database with as many people as you can. Share it on social media, your blog, your podcast, your YouTube channel if you have one. Link to it from your author website. Link to it from your newsletter and autoresponder list. And if you're not an urban fantasy writer, don't worry. Just replicate this process in your genre. And remember that you don't have to go through and hire a programmer or do all the things that I did. I initially conceived the Urban Fantasy Book Database as a Google spreadsheet that people could just simply view and then email me to make recommendations. It could be as simple as that. And it doesn't, you can come up with a universal classification system for your genre for free. It's not something that you have to pay money for. So all the stuff that I talk about, I was very fortunate and happy to have worked with John and Ben, but you don't have to do all of that. You could find alternative ways to do this in your genre. So this was my thought process and how I worked through the problem of finding readers and similar books in your genre.